Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here and thanks for checking out my podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell for new episodes. You can also find Shine Without Shame on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. All right, Josh. So today my guest is my friend and former colleague, Joshfreund. Josh is a health and benefits professional and an environmental enthusiast. His professional history includes employment at 8 different companies, all with a focus in understanding the healthcare delivery system and health improvement. When he's not thinking about healthcare, he can be found hiking through the mountains, out on a bike ride, or spending time with his family. Thanks for joining me, Josh.
My pleasure.
You know, I love chatting with you.
Yeah, it's good.
Let's see, I guess it was just before the pandemic started. So last year, March of 2020 was the last time we saw each other in person, because after that, we started working from home and then I actually left the company. So
decades ago really is how it feels, huh?
Like years, emphasis on the yes. Yeah. But it's so good to connect with you. You know, I always love chatting with you about health, well-being, anything interesting related to those areas of life. And you and I always get really deep into sharing our opinions and get deep into our thoughts and our passions around health and well-being. So I know
culture. I mean, don't forget about culture. Absolutely. We talked quite a bit about that.
We did. In fact, we just had the conversation about culture too. Yeah, but
we
outside of a office setting, I suppose. But yes, I thought it would be really interesting to hear you.
No, sweetie. Sorry, hold on. I'm going to pull in my kid here. Really, we're roasting marshmallows outside. But anyway, continue.
Roasting marshmallows outside. Just the marshmallows, or are you going to then? Well, roasting the marshmallows, and you're going to add them s'mores to the graham and the.
That's right.
Bar.
The works.
Do you all do any specialty items for the s'mores? Like, do you do gluten-free or sugar-free or dairy-free, or do you just do the regular old?
Only thing special is that Jenna makes the marshmallows. They're homemade marshmallows.
Whoa.
And they're delicious. They're delicious.
I might have to get that recipe and just modify it slightly with maybe certain ingredients. But oh my gosh, I didn't even know that was possible to do it at home.
Can I tell you something? I mean, when we were talking about what we would, what we discuss on your podcast and that sort of thing. And I found the fire lighter to light the fire. Okay. When we were setting up this conversation, you were telling me what your podcast is about. I feel it's entirely appropriate to say that homemade marshmallows are amazing. And I love that my wife makes them. But one of the areas where, if we're going to talk about shame, one of the areas that I always struggle with is in the choices I make around the food that I eat.
Say more.
You and I have talked about this, and we've known each other a long time. I'm a fitness enthusiast. I mean, I'm not obsessive necessarily about staying in absolute great shape and that sort of thing. But I want to believe that I am going to lead a healthy, productive lifestyle well into, my 70s and 80s. And a big part of that is diet. And the family that I grew up in is not a health conscious family. And so I spend a lot of time reacting to my own childhood and seeing what my parents' health looks like as a result of the choices they made, and seeing myself making some of those same choices and feeling a lot of shame about that. And it's interesting because on the one hand, there's some benefit from a perspective. Maybe there is some benefit to feeling shame because that shame limits, for instance, how much I am willing to allow myself to indulge in things like homemade marshmallows or, I don't know, chocolate sundaes or what have you. But it's not the healthiest way to approach that conversation, right? It's not the shame is not the healthiest way to achieve that kind of control that I want to have over the food that I'm putting in my body. So it's funny because I really want to go out and eat these marshmallows, but I know I'm going to eat a marshmallow and I'm going to feel a little bit like maybe shame, maybe not shame, maybe guilt. I don't know.
Okay. There's a
We were
distinction,
talking a
sure.
little bit about that distinction, right? So anyway, that again,
Well,
I digress, but I think it's fascinating the way shame sort of like weaves itself into so many different areas of life,
no doubt, Josh. If you do eat one, though, eat one for me too, please. Oh, uh, you could tell what's on my mind. That is interesting, the idea of shame around food consumption, and family culture
Mhm.
related to shame. I think for me, when I grew up, I had parents, and especially a father, who was health conscious. And when it came to food, he was health conscious. He was a medical professional. And so I'm sure that influenced the choices he made with food and what he wanted the family to consume. Also, he was an athlete. So again, another influence. But it is interesting because for him, it's also relative what's healthy. This, when I was growing up in the 80s, milk was considered like healthy, gotta have it. Milk, it does the
Mhm.
body good. I'm thinking of all those ads. And I'm sure it does some bodies good, but it didn't do my body good because I had an intolerance, but I didn't know about it and nobody else knew about it in the family. And
Mhm.
I can remember being maybe slightly shamed about some of my desires when it came to food and the food that I wanted to eat, or that I was interested in eating. Now I recognize that actually it was just instinct, and my instincts were right on. Certain things I just really wanted. I really wanted fats. My parents fortunately did not deprive me of like the chicken skin, because that for me was like the cat's meow. Pardon me for all those who are vegetarian or vegan. But as a child, that was really like an important part of my diet. And I craved it, and nobody made me feel bad about that. But sometimes with milk, and I know people pronounce that word differently. I pronounce it milk. I I I think maybe I vaguely do recall a little bit of shame from maybe my dad in particular about not drinking enough milk, or when I would complain about drinking non-fat milk, because I wanted that rich creamy 2%, and I only got that when I went to my like best friend's house and stayed overnight.
Mm.
Again, looking back, and after I've been educated about certain foods and nutritional values, I recognize and I've learned why I didn't like the non-fat milk. It wasn't because I was a bratty kid, and it wasn't just because my friends got to drink the 2% and I didn't. Actually, what I learned more in the recent years as an adult or young adult is that non-fat milk has the most lactose of all milk. And
Mm.
so as someone who didn't know they were lactose intolerant, but instinctively did, I was always wanting the creamier milk because it actually had less lactose content, or less
Mm.
lactose. Amazing. I didn't know that.
Mm.
But I do remember, to your point, like that there was something in the family around, and maybe from my dad again in particular, about, oh, you need to drink milk. You got to drink it. Come on. This is what you need. This is what's best for you. Don't fight it. Like, why are you being difficult?
Mm.
And now I'm like, oh, there were so many things that I just knew on some level, but I was too young to, show my parents the research or even do the research.
Yeah.
Anyways, what do you think about that? Because what you shared about family culture just briefly reminded me of that experience.
I think it's really fascinating how we're able to be influenced by our family and the culture around us. And in some ways, those influences cause us to inhibit our own natural sort of, I don't know, an instinct, right? Like there's so much about the way that you're brought up in the world, like your only understanding of the world is the one, at least in your early going, it's the understanding that your parents are giving to you and that your parents are introducing you to through the social interactions that they curate. And that's what creates the culture that you're around, right? And so if the culture that you are brought up in, and you and I are roughly the same age, and so you and I can remember those commercials where it's just like an empty glass and a milk jug pouring into the glass and it says milk does a body good.
Yes.
And so you've got that on the TV, you've got family members who are telling you, and they're the most influential people in your life, certainly in your early life. So you've got them telling you it's good for you. And it doesn't matter whether you have the, I mean, to me, what's interesting about this is that we may have this internal thermostat that's saying like, you know, hey, this is a little warm for me, or this is a little cold for me. But so much of our early years are built upon our social interactions and those family connections. And you know, it's like a process. Becoming an adult is almost, unfortunately, in some ways, a process of unlearning as much as it is of learning, right? Like, you know, I started to learn this quite a bit. I wouldn't really have been somebody who advocated therapy, for instance, for anybody for a long, long time. But as somebody who now has to run mental health programs for a very large company, you know, at some point you have to like taste your own medicine, right? Like if I'm going to be developing these programs and trying to prioritize mental health for people, I have to do that for myself as well. And now that I've actually experienced therapy and I've understood some of my behaviors and ways of thinking and you know, thinking traps and all those sorts of things, I really have come around to this idea that like you can't grow and develop as a person unless you understand and remove the blockages that are to some extent inhibiting you from becoming your absolute best self. I don't even know if I like that term, best self, but certainly like an optimized form of yourself, right? Like the truest form of yourself. And that was a real challenge for me. I've always viewed life as a very progressive thing. Like you get older, you get these experiences, and those experiences inform the way you see the world, and you continue to develop and grow and change and learn. But if you're doing all of that with you know, unexplored trauma, and if you're doing that with, you know, like an inhibition in your sort of natural, your kind of natural instincts, then you're growing and building, but you're growing and building upon something that's less than your optimal self. And that's been, I mean, again, I'm still in this process, but it's been, you know, this comes back to, again, what we were talking about before we had this, you know, before we started talking today, just in leading up to this conversation. This is one of my practices now, is to really try and think about when I feel a really strong emotion, whether that's anger or sadness or guilt or shame. You know, I really try and step back and think about where that emotion is coming from. At what point in my life did I have an experience, whether it was a traumatic experience or an experience that was really exciting for me, but at what point in my life did I have an experience that informed the way I am reacting to a situation today? And if I can step back, and it's hard to do, and I don't really succeed all that often, but it's a practice. But if I can step back and see the emotion as it's coming and going, it allows me to, I don't want to say get through that emotion, but it certainly allows me to process it, right? It allows me to like actually look at an emotion and compartmentalize it, accept it for what it is, and move on. And I think that's the the practice that I'm working on for myself right now. And it goes across all of these things. So, sorry, I took us way off the path of filling up a glass of milk, but, I think it's all related.
It
I
is.
really
No need
do.
to apologize. That's a podcast for you. It's free flowing, and on this topic, or on the around the idea of shame, there's so much, like you said, that's connected. That is interesting. I do want to just simply acknowledge here that I am always grateful to you for recommending and really actually encouraging me to make use of at that time our company's benefit for therapy. And I think it was I don't know if it was for grief counseling in particular. I think it was actually because I had just gone through a heavy loss, lost a family member, and it was my first time going through heavy grief. And as a friend, I would talk to you and tell you how my day was and tell you, I feel awful. And you were always, as kind and warm to me as you always were and have been and are. But I also remember in one of those conversations, you said, don't forget, Tiffany, we've got that benefit. I think you get like 5 sessions with a therapist, and I took advantage of it and I was so grateful. And so you really did extend the talk to the walk, and or maybe it's a reciprocal thing. Like you said, you had to learn for yourself and put yourself into the reality of exploring and taking advantage of, and utilizing the benefits that you were promoting yourself. And so I want to just acknowledge again how grateful I am for you for that and that encouragement, especially when someone's grieving. It's so hard to encourage them to do anything in particular.
Yeah.
And it was like the perfect time and place for me to hear what you had to say, which was just a simple reminder about that benefit. I took advantage of it and it helped.
I appreciate that. And I also say I learned something from you going through that, Tiffany, because I remember you saying something. We were having a conversation just after the loss, and you were saying that, and I experienced this myself. I've lost a family member, and grief is a really awkward feeling for people who aren't feeling it to identify with. And most people, their response to grief is avoidance.
Yes.
And I remember you specifically saying that, like, it's hard. You were talking about how difficult it was because, people don't know what to say. And sometimes they just kind of avoid the conversation. So it feels in the moment when you need authentic connection, because I think of all of the feelings that I've ever experienced, grief is the one where it doesn't happen for everybody at the same time, but at some point in the cycle of processing that grief, what you seek more than anything is a connection to somebody that can help you process through the emotion and the feeling and that sort of thing. And it's in that specific time with grief where people's tendency is to pull away, because grief is such an awkward topic and it's difficult to know what to say. And you taught me something because you told me what you needed, which is something that I think we all need to really, I just think we culturally, as a society, would benefit from being able to clearly articulate and be willing to express specifically what we need at any given moment. And you said, I just really need somebody to talk to and just be normal with for a little bit. And I really, honestly, Tiffany, I grew in that conversation quite a bit, because I don't believe that I was actually acting, I don't know if I would say like perfectly or whatever, but I felt awkward with your grief, right?
Sure.
Because we all do. But having gone through that with you and experienced it with you in those conversations, I'd like to think I've grown. I mean, my reflection on grief has certainly changed a little bit since then. So for what it's worth, I appreciate you and your authenticity, and your willingness to just be out there with that. And, again, I mean, I'll bring it back to this topic of shame. I mean, so much of this conversation around grief is also a conversation about shame. Because when you avoid something, you're avoiding this conversation around grief. I mean, I don't want to speak universally. I would say for myself, I feel shame at not being capable of having the conversation, right? Not knowing the right words to say, not knowing how to empathize and be there for somebody. And that makes me feel shame. And as a result of that shame, I avoid the conversation, right? It's interesting how powerful that emotion really is, and how it can kind of take over so many different interactions.
Yes. Yes. And that, thanks for acknowledging my participation in that, because I didn't know that I was going to be able to, I didn't know I had that capacity. And it ended up, and I've shared this on the podcast previously, it ended up having an effect on other people. You and I were not on the same team officially. And so the teammates that I had with the first loss were in the same boat as you and as many others are, and as I was before I had that heavy loss. Awkward, trying to give somebody the space, don't want to see them cry. And so I was able to process with them the way I processed with you and say, here's what I need. Here's what would be really, really helpful for me. What was incredible was almost a year later, just a little over a year later, I had a second loss, and it was another heavy loss, lost a family member. And what was amazing was with my teammates, because I'm around them much more than I was around you, I was able to actually see an evolution in our dynamic. The ones who had been there with me for the first loss the previous year knew what to do. And one of them in particular really stepped up in incredible ways. And it was just simply knowing how they could participate, what kind of role they could play. And that was really powerful for me to witness that. I don't think they necessarily, I don't know if they processed how they had evolved on the journey with me from one year to the next, but that was a really powerful experience for me all around that whole year and a half, because of what I just shared, because of the change in the environment and in the culture of our team, almost around operating, or responding to someone's grief and someone's loss. And that makes me also think, Josh, about this idea. It's a big topic, but however we want to chew it up here, let's do that. Thinking about the idea of culture, workplace culture, and bringing your whole self to work. Yeah, I don't know if you've noticed it. It seems like that idea has surfaced in the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, however long. But more recently, this idea, you should bring your whole self to work. And I've heard some people debate this, because some people say, well, then you're going to be bringing all your drama, all your, you can't sit around and just like cry or be depressed at work all day. You're not being productive. You're getting paid to do work. But I'm curious to know your thoughts on this idea. And I know it's a big idea, but however we want to approach it here and now, I think is an interesting idea, because there are different perspectives, and people place a different kind of value than others on this idea of bringing your whole self to the workplace.
I mean, I suppose I would challenge, first of all, I would challenge anybody who is arguing that like you don't want to bring, the drama from your home life, whatever that may be, into the office, et cetera, et cetera. The truth of it, from my perspective, is that you always are bringing your whole self to work. There's no other way to be. I mean, you are who you are. Your identity is everything you do inside the office space. It's everything you do outside of the office space. And so from my perspective, to say don't bring your whole self to work, or I actually just don't see the logic in it. I would say that, like, the argument against might be, well, if you have something dramatic happening, some relationship troubles, or I don't know, let's say something positive, hey, my kid just got into Stanford, and and that's not relevant to your job, but it's all relevant, because even if you're not working at a company that's encouraging you to share what's happening in your personal life is still happening to you. It's still affecting your mood. It's still affecting, if it's affecting your mood, it's affecting how you interact with people. So it's affecting your interpersonal relationships. There is no such thing as not bringing your whole self. That's different than, I think, bringing your authentic self.
That's interesting.
So bringing your whole self, from again, this is just my perspective, that's like marrying your professional and your personal and just saying, look, it's all the same person. Your authentic self is different. I actually struggle with authenticity in my roles.
How so?
And well, because where we work together. So, I mean, you saw like my role there and how I experienced and that sort of thing. And I actually went home from that job on a fairly regular basis, feeling immense pressure to perform at a level that I didn't necessarily, or to perform in a way that didn't necessarily resonate with me all the time. In other words, I had such at least in the early going, it was such a visible role. And there was this expectation behind that visibility that I would be like the health guy, that I would be constant like that. I was always the person that was leading the charge on health initiatives and all of this stuff. Going along with that was this expectation that I was also extremely social, extroverted, outgoing, talking to people all the time, building connections. And the truth of it is, I'd say a more authentic version of myself is I really enjoy solitude. I don't enjoy solitude all the time, but the role wasn't a reflection of my truly authentic self. And my truly authentic self is one that enjoys walking with my dog in the mountains for hours and hours by myself alone, or sitting in a corner and reading a good book by myself, right? Like that's a part of me, and it's an authentic part of me that I didn't feel I could reflect in the way that I was expected to show up to work. And I do think that the workplace is changing a little bit there. I mean, certainly it depends on the company. You got all these personality tests that are encouraged now, so people can, identify as I'm a number 9 or I'm an ENFP or whatever it is. But I sort of roll my eyes, but the truth is that it is giving people language to help them understand themselves and express that understanding of themselves to other people, and give other people a shared language that allows them to talk to each other and sort of speak to each other in ways that are reflected through those personality profiles. I don't know that any one of those personality profiles is a great comprehensive understanding of a person's self, of a person's whole being, but it's certainly like at least a small window, right? So I agree with you. I think it's changing. I also think that you and I had an experience at that last company that shows we have some work to do. And I don't know if you know exactly what I'm talking about, but it has to do with the speaker that we brought in.
Yes.
And the general response to that we got was the resistance to it, just to me shows that we've still got some work to do when it comes to this topic of authenticity and really like having a whole authentic self be present at work, because it wasn't welcome in that case, right? I mean, I think we can agree there was a faction of people for which it was not welcome.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know we're being vague, but there were still 20, 15, somewhere around 10 to 20 people who I think benefited from it,
Mm-hmm.
a handful of them who told me that it was impactful. And that's why the speaker came, because it's hard to put dollars into the value of something. Sometimes, like, people charge money, sometimes a lot of money to speak or do a workshop at a company, but sometimes it's there's something a little bit more, I think, nebulous, or just more, a little deeper than the average person is looking for in terms of a service that can be offered. And I think in the case we're speaking of, there was a service that was rendered that was quite valuable. Now, it didn't maybe reach or impact the hundreds of people that's, would maybe make the value of the that event seem on the surface worthwhile. But I think in this particular case, there was a greater impact than probably will ever be recognized. But to your point, it did speak to culture, absolutely. And it spoke to, well, a lot of aspects of culture, and the intellectual culture in particular being very dominant. But
Mm-hmm.
you're right. There's a lot of work to do, not just at that company, but I think many places. I'm always about what tools are actually going to be useful. I'm the kind of person who I'll use alternative medicine. I will use alternative or energy healing tools, tuning forks and stones, and I'll meditate. And I've said this here before, I'm not doing those things or using those tools to look cool, to feel like I'm trendy, to feel like I'm on the edge of something. I'm utilizing those tools or doing those activities because I have found that they benefit me. I want the most amount of tools in my toolbox as possible. I'm not, for me, there isn't an issue, or like, there's no ego for me when it comes to utilizing tools. Like, oh, I don't want to be identified with that, or, oh, I just don't. Because for me, it's not like I'm not joining all these clubs. I'm not going to join 50 different like wellness clubs, or, what I'm trying to say is it's less about my identity. It's more about the tools.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be a hang up. Like, that's the word I was looking for. They're not hang ups for me. Like, I don't get caught up in the cultures surrounding them, or the cultures or the current evolution of the cultures, say around yoga or meditation, tuning forks, again, crystals, whatever. They're in and of themselves, they're not religions to me. Like, I don't, or other word people like to use is cult. They're not those things to me. They're actually tools. And I found them to benefit me in multiple ways. So I'm detached from what people think about me if they know I use them. I'm using it to help me. Does that make sense? So I guess I know I'm kind of taking us, I don't know if I'm taking us to a different place. Maybe I'm just going a little deeper with the idea that you're talking about culture. The perception of culture is really powerful, and it can inhibit and discourage, depending on how much, what kind of value is placed on that particular culture. So in our case, with the speaker, it was what that speaker represented, or at least what people perceived that speaker to represent on the surface, wasn't valuable and wasn't even legitimate, for some people. But at the end of the day, what are the results? And we can't quantify the results because it's very personal, based on the participants. But my sense is that the results were quite profound. Maybe not for 100, maybe for 10 people. And I don't know, sometimes I think gosh, if those 10 people were willing to show up and were open enough to receive and it benefited their lives, that's huge. You can't say that about every event, even when there's 1,000 people.
Yeah, no, there were, trust me, I held and continue to hold many events. And that one was, and again, I think back to back to this discussion of authenticity, I think one of the reasons that was so impactful to me, and I would agree with you, I think I saw people coming out of that talk who were very much positively impacted by it, and more so than most other meetings or seminars or panel discussions that I've hosted. And I think it's because in the corporate world, I mean, one of the things that I struggled with, but I will say at that last company that we worked at together, and I know you and I had many discussions about the culture, and I think we agree that whether it was always there or not, at some point at the inception of the company, there was good intent to build a company with this like positive culture, right?
That's right.
This culture of sort of like an almost like an academic culture where people could like challenge each other and build new ideas, but also a culture that was affirming to self, right? Like that where people treated each other with respect, kindness. At least that was the way I had sort of internalized a lot of the messages that I had heard when I started at the company. But there is this sort of interesting phenomenon that exists in the corporate world. I'm experiencing it in my current role. I've moved on from our last company as well. And it's just like there is a corporate language, right? It's like to work in the corporate world, you have to be able to translate whatever you would normally say into this very specific type of corporate speak. That's if you want to actually move up in your career.
Mm-hmm.
And that puts it dampens authenticity, right? Because you're trying to translate how you feel and how you react to situations and how you want to behave into this sort of like amalgamation of corporate language that allows you to express that, but only if you've contained it into this little box, right? So everything has to be packaged up just so. And it's interesting because I work for a company now that is much larger than our last company, and has been doing, frankly, what our last company was doing, has been doing it a lot longer. And Tiffany, I would tell you, I mean, I've only worked there now for, well, it's been almost 11 months now. But in that time, there are very few differences between my last job and this job when it comes to the language that they are using to build the culture, right? All of the things that I felt made that company, the first company, unique and different and allowed, and I felt very passionately about what I was doing and that sort of thing. All of that exists at this company because they're using the exact same language, but all of that language is prescriptive. It's all very corporate. It's all been massaged to make sure that it's not, offending people, which is fine. I understand that. But it's also being massaged to make sure that it doesn't, like, I don't know, cross a legal boundary or, jeopardize a scientific understanding, because these companies are both founded in science. And it's just a really interesting thing to experience.
I hear you. I know. I mean, you're coming from a different perspective because your role was different than mine was at our last company, but I think that there is such a thing as office culture and corporate culture. So the values that start, like what you're talking about to me, is there are certain values that have been attached to maybe we can't say totally global, although I guess these companies can exist in other parts of the world. So it can be seen as a global culture. But it's a culture, it's a certain culture that is associated with office life and companies.
Mm-hmm.
And there, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, I believe, because I think there's a history to the evolution
Mm-hmm.
of the culture. Like, I'm sure it all leads back to certain values and certain probably male dominated values, and that weren't necessarily evil. And I'm not, that don't anyone hear me think I'm saying that it's all rooted in evilness, but there were certain values that were believed to be the most valuable or the most important to success, to productivity. So I get, I get why it's so deeply rooted in some ways the way it is, but yeah, there needs to be some sort of liberation of some of that culture to make room for, maybe this is a stretch, but I kind of take it back to the point that I was stressing about my use of all these tools, these well-being and health tools. I don't, if the tools help, let's use them. Let's
Mm-hmm.
not get hung up on maybe their origin or the parts of the world they came from and how maybe we don't identify with those cultures. Uh, it's like when you really get to know the truth of something, then you know what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can truly judge. I don't mean judge in a negative way, but you can assess, is this useful or not? But if you don't even want to consider, if you don't even want to really observe or consider the truth of something, then you're never really going to know if it's valuable or not.
Yeah.
And there's something in that willingness to explore, to acknowledge, to seek out truth, to seek out utility, that isn't valuable in the corporate office culture. On some levels, in some ways, not always, but I guess what I'm really saying is in the health and well-being realm, since
Yeah.
that's the area that you and I both have experience and interest and passion in. There's something about that that's just too, it's not grounded. And I think I beg to differ. I really
Mm.
beg to differ that the alternatives, the alternative health or well-being tools and resources and principles are not grounded in truth.
Mm.
I think it's what you do. I think it's what people have done with them or how they utilize them that have made them seem weird sometimes. But there's just there
Yeah.
has to be willingness. There has to be willingness to explore. There has to be an understanding if there's value in it. But again, I say, but why not? Why not fill up the toolbox with more tools if they're actually
So,
truly helpful?
a part of the problem from my perspective in this is inequity,
Mm-hmm.
in that there are, I mean, I am very happily not in Silicon Valley anymore. um,
Mm-hmm.
but let's take Silicon Valley as a really specific example of this point, which is that if you happen to be a genius inventor, engineer, or something like that, you can be as authentic as you want to be, and people just, they say, well, you're eccentric, but you started this company that's, a multi-billion-dollar company, and so that eccentricity is welcomed, right? It's celebrated. Like, we put these people up on pedestals, but
Mm-hmm.
not everybody is afforded the same generosity of interpretation, right? So where Steve Jobs was described as eccentric, even so his authentic self it's been well established that he was kind of a jerk to people, but he also founded this amazing company, and he was, created a multi-billion-dollar company. And so, oh, we write it off. That's eccentric. Okay, you could argue that Steve Jobs was able to treat people the way he thought he wanted to treat people, right? He could treat people however he wanted to. He was being authentic. That's who he is. He's not going to apologize for it. You could make the same case for, I won't name names, but you could name off a bunch of Silicon Valley executives, and you could say the same thing about them. They go out kite surfing and I don't know, all this other stuff, and they're eccentric, and they just get to live their lives and be authentic and be whoever they want to be. But the companies that they run, the people inside those companies are not afforded that. And I think this is a really broad cultural problem. It's not just focused necessarily on just this idea of like the corporate culture as this sort of monolith. It also has to do with the way we deify, the way we have built our society to deify certain people and allow them the freedom to be whoever they want to be. But the vast majority of us don't have that freedom.
Right.
And even at our last company, I would say the same thing was true. I mean, there was a very distinct difference between the way some people in that company, and this is probably true of most companies, could treat each other, could treat their subordinates, the people that work for them, could treat the people that they work with outside of the company. There was a very distinct difference between those people and the vast majority of us. And there are ways that benefits a company. I would say I'm seeing this really big, right? Like everybody is talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Everybody is talking about diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think to the extent I worked for a company where the leader at that company talked about his own experience and realization of when it hit him that it was something that we needed to address, and it was through this personal interaction that he had. I appreciate and applaud that leader for being forthright, authentic, sharing that experience in a way that actually develops a conversation among a broader group of people at a company about how we interact with each other, about social inequity, or racial inequity. So there are ways that kind of authenticity flows down, right? But the truth of it is, if you can see one person's authentic self and the positive impact it has on a company, shouldn't you be able to see how everybody being able to bring that authenticity to work would have multiplicative effects on the positive company culture, right? Like that, it's just interesting to me that leap hasn't been made yet. And maybe companies are starting to work on it, but I think we still get trapped in, again, that sort of like box of how we're supposed to relate to each other and what we're supposed to say to each other and how we're supposed to get work done. And until a company can figure out how to break down some of those barriers, I don't know. I'm not super pessimistic necessarily, but it's a challenge. It's a big challenge.
It's a challenge because it's more than just checking a box. It's more than just creating a diversity inclusion program. It's like that can be a tool, that can be a mechanism, but it's about the connections. It's about, okay, what does it mean to show up as a human with other humans in the human experience of life at a place of work? We haven't, it's just the values are kind of in different places. They're on different places of importance right now, and then where they probably need to be in some cases. And that's why I appreciate what you're saying. You're not pessimistic, but you're acknowledging this is like a monumental shift. And that is because it's not just an intellectual shift. It's like hearts have to change, the human spirit has to kind of wake up to a different
Mm.
reality. That's huge. That's
Yeah.
more than just maybe what's happening right now. Although people do mean well, but it's missing something very real,
Hmm.
that will make all the difference. It's missing that ingredient. If we want to liken it to a recipe, it's missing the ingredient that not only makes it rise, it makes other people makes you want to eat it and makes you want to share it with others. I mean, it's just missing something that this where we're at, I should say, on the journey of true equity, inclusion.
Mm.
There are just certain principles that are going to have to come into play. And I have in my own personal life, my own kind of values and belief systems. I believe I know what that principle is that would be monumental, but and I'll just say it, but I think that it's, well, when I say it, maybe it'll make it clear why it's so hard. To me, the principle that's missing is the oneness of humanity. I mean,
Mm.
maybe that sounds very Pollyannish but I think it's deep, because if you take that principle into every aspect of life, that's our operating principle. From there, that's how we make decisions. That's how we create everything. That will fundamentally change and shift what we're doing here and like how
Mm.
we're operating. But and this is just my opinion. You don't have to agree with it, Josh, but that to me that's what's missing. And it
Hmm.
seems so simple, the oneness of humanity. Like, well, okay, how do you manifest that in every arena of life? But somehow we have to find a way to do that, in my opinion, to actually make the kind of shift that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, some of this can start with, um, again, I wish I did this more or better, but I am trying to bring mindfulness to it, as it relates specifically to work. Anyway, um, I try to approach every relationship with the assumption that the person that I'm talking to is doing the best they can, operating with good intent, um, and is just as worried about, having a job, feeding a family, keeping a roof over their head, as I am. And it's easy for me to do that. I find it easier to do that when it's somebody who has emailed me and caused me to have an emotional reaction, maybe anger or guilt or something. It's easier for me to do that than it is. So it's easier for me to do it in reaction than it is in being proactive. In other words, like when somebody does it to me, I try and stop and I say, you know what? I am angry, but this person is probably behaving this way or said that thing because they're worried that if I don't deliver, they're not going to be able to deliver on their job, and therefore they're going to get into trouble, and they believe I might be jeopardizing their livelihood.
That's right.
It's harder for me though in the reach out. The mindfulness, mindfulness is a consistent constant, right? Like it is, if you're going to be mindful, and it's a practice for a reason. So please don't misinterpret me. I'm not trying to hold myself to an impossible standard here, but I am trying to practice in the way that I communicate out to people my own needs with that same level of understanding ahead of time that whatever their reaction is to what I'm sending them, they are still operating with the best intent. They are still right, like because the truth is if you don't do that, if you don't assume best intent, if you don't assume that the person is experiencing the same things you are, If you forget that, you start to lose a little bit of your humanity. You start to disconnect, right? Like that feeling of oneness that you're expressing. I mean, I would say that that's a shared understanding of our human experience, right? Just we could get into spirituality and talk about my idea of oneness from a spiritual perspective, and I do actually have, kind of a spiritual understanding of oneness. But as it relates to interpersonal relationships, I think just a basic understanding that we are all on this planet, fighting to survive, just trying to do the best we can for ourselves and our family members and for the friends and social circles that we have and that sort of thing. And to the extent we can bring that into the corporate world, that's probably a good first step for authenticity.
And if I may add to what you're saying, what you said, you made a distinction just a minute ago. Well, I don't, I have an idea maybe about oneness and spirituality, but when it comes to like the practical, see, to me, it is all the same. We're all, I mean, our right now, humanity is so caught up on semantics, and because of our history with religion and spirituality and the negative connotations that a lot of people have with those concepts, we've divorced everything from what we kind of call spirituality. But to me, it's all the same. Whatever you how you just described the idea, your understanding of we're all on this planet together, that to me is spiritual. That to me is the essence of what we're doing here. So that's why it's like, I don't see it as separate. I see it as you apply that to work, you apply that to governance, you apply that to financials. I mean, this can turn into a whole other conversation, but I just wanted to acknowledge or at least tell you that I connect with what you're saying, but I don't see them as a distinction. I don't see spirit, like the idea of oneness through the spirit or spirituality as separate from what we're actually doing day in and day out on this planet. I think that's why I think that principle is so valuable, because it influences every arena of life.
Yeah.
And whether you want to say there's a God involved or religion involved, that's up to you, because that's a personal choice. But there is something more powerful than just what we can come up with here that has connected us. And it really, and that sense or that spirit or whatever you want to call it, to me is what transforms. They always talk about transforms, because they always talk about the human spirit. It transcends anything, right? It's like the human spirit is so powerful. I think that there has to be more of an openness and willingness to allow the idea of spirit to come into every arena of life and not see it as separate. I know that I'm really getting like very, very profound here, but to me, it is profound, because that really is, at the end of the day, what we're talking about. I think our species will evolve. We will get there. Otherwise, we're going to completely destroy our species.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to find something that we can hold on to that is a little more powerful than just what we can intellectualize. Yeah. I think that is powerful, because it's gotten us, we've created, light, electricity, and we've done so much to evolve from just the days of fighting off the lions and the predators, who are hunting, and we've come a long ways through the intellect. I just don't think the intellect's going to get us to the finish line. And when I say finish line, I mean like where humanity's like, where our species is like really at a place of high capacity of functioning in every arena of life, where equity and justice are not like watchwords, but they're how we live life. Well, we could just keep talking about this, but I just wanted to say what you shared really inspired me to just share what I shared, because I don't think it's separate. I just don't think I don't think collectively we're there yet, where we're willing to accept.
I hate making like random pop culture references, but by any chance, have you seen the movie I Heart Huckabees?
No, I've heard of it though.
It's such a good movie.
Okay.
And so the reason I bring it up is because there's a concept in the movie that essentially Dustin Hoffman's character is trying to explain to Jason Bateman's character the general guiding philosophy of how the therapy he's receiving all works. And he uses a blanket, and he holds his hand up under a part of the blanket, and he says, you know, this is a murder, and over here this is a birth, and over here this is a marriage, and over here is a job loss, and here is a fire. And the point that he's making, if you hadn't gotten this already, and probably people who are watching this are like, yeah, you don't have to be so explicit, but the point is, it's all the blanket, right? Like something happening over here is the blanket is all attached, so it's impacting this over here, right? This is the concept that we're talking about, this understanding that that, and I think it has real practical real world application to us right now. Like something that I'm personally frustrated by. I will try not to wander too deeply into something like politics, but what's happened recently in Texas, for instance, and a woman's right to choose there. You know, it's easy for people who don't live in a state where something like that is happening, or a state where people's health is not being taken into account when big decisions are being made about public policy. It's easy for you over here to say, no, that doesn't impact me. I think what's interesting to me is the experience that we're all going through right now with COVID in particular. And again, I know you probably don't want to wander too far into this subject, but I do think that the pandemic is giving us a glimpse into that oneness, maybe not in the way that we would want to experience it. Maybe it would be better if we all saw like an extraterrestrial. That would be a different way of us experiencing oneness, right? But certainly you can see the practicality of understanding oneness in the way that COVID has moved from state to state, or the way that you have a single event where people from multiple places go to that event and then take COVID home with them. And it's a terrible example maybe to use from the perspective of sadness and anger and all of the things that are impacting us. But if there's one thing that I hope comes out of this experience, it's that we'll start to understand our interconnectedness. You know, the way that decisions being made about public policy, the way that our own individual actions are constantly impacting people around us. And I mean, you know, who knows, we've strayed quite a ways from the corporate conversation here, but to the extent that that kind of understanding can be applied in a corporate environment, I hope it will benefit you know, companies and that sort of thing. I mean, we'll see.
Yeah, it is the macro and micro. I mean, it's we didn't so much stray, we just brought it up, you know, we zoomed out to big picture. You know me, I'm a big picture thinker. I can't not help but bring in the universal aspects of everything. It's just the way I'm designed. I'm built that way. But I've so loved this conversation. I had no doubt that we would venture into, you know, meaningful areas of life and not just explore, but I think what I appreciate about you and I, Josh, as friends and as when we were colleagues, we have our opinions, we have our backgrounds and what we value, and you know what our experience in life. But I always find that whenever we're talking about important, which was almost always very important, meaningful topics, there's an area that we seem to leave open to allow for discovery, not just exploring, but like really like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Actually, like we allow room. And I think that's the beautiful thing about, and you know, why I do appreciate our friendship and our connection we're not so set in our ways that we're not willing to, again, we want to investigate to make sure it's what we believe to be true, but
Yeah.
we are willing to allow and accept new ideas or new thoughts or new perspectives. And I really think that's the only way to move forward in the world on the collective large scale of humanity's journey. And it's okay. Not everybody is willing to do the same, but for those of us who are, we'll just keep moving forward.
Yeah. I was going to say the next time we can talk about AI and how we're all just living in a simulation anyway. I'm kidding.
I have consciously put down my phone more and more these days. But it's true. Everything, even if you're not talking about social media or just scrolling through your phone, even if you're not talking about that kind of passive connection to technology, but everything we do, almost all the services now, everything has to be done online. I mean, online, phone, whatever device. That to me is what I've been reflecting on more and more. So that would be interesting to have that conversation. And I always end the podcast conversation by asking my guest, and you referenced a movie, but I always ask them, which TV show, new or old, do they recommend and why?
I unfortunately watch way too much TV. I think Black Mirror on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
Where my head is today is trying to really think about and understand where society is going. And usually, so we didn't really get too much into this, but my head is very much into like kind of the environmental side of things right now. And, if you really think about climate change and where we're headed, it can get pretty dark, unfortunately. And Black Mirror is sort of a reflection of some of it's interesting. It explores technology and the direction that technology is taking us and that sort of thing. But it's a little bit dark and thought-provoking. And I appreciate both of those things. I think you can't have light without the dark, right?
That's right.
There's another one that was really, super, super, so sorry, I know you said one, but I'm going to give you two.
I'll give you two. I'll allow two.
HBO did a 4-part documentary, so it's not like an official show, I guess, but it was called Exterminate All the Brutes. And it's essentially the history of racism from its inception back like around the Spanish Inquisition during the expulsion of Jews from Spain, all the way through to today. And as somebody who considers myself an ally of the BIPOC community, even somebody who's read a lot of the literature that informed, I just thought that the documentary was put together in such a good, impactful, powerful way. Anyway, so I encourage everybody to watch Exterminate All the Brutes, especially if you consider yourself an ally, because I don't know, because it's important to confront your own, kind of your own background and past and that sort of thing.
I've heard about it. I haven't seen it, but I've heard.
It's please, Tiffany. So
provocative.
Good. Yeah. Yep.
Awesome, Josh. Thank you so much, Josh. This has been very fulfilling, and I am so glad we got the time to connect. Thanks for making time.
My pleasure, Tiffany. It was good talking to you again.